oppressive August night in Southampton County, Virginia, in 1831, where the air hung heavy with the scent of pine and the stifling humidity of a late summer drought. In the darkened woods near the cabin of Joseph Travis, a man named Nat Turner stood waiting. He was a preacher, a man of deep intellect and haunting dehumanization of his people. That night, under the cover of a divine sign, he ignited that would consume the complacency. Fire that would consume the complacency of the entire American South. If you enjoy deep dives into the turning points that define our history, please consider subscribing to Against All Odds, where we peel back the layers of the past to understand the forces that shaped our worlds. Nat Turner did not merely want to escape, and Turner did not want to negotiate. He wanted to dismantle an institution that defined his existence and succeeded in shattering the illusion of total control slaveholders had cultivated for generations. To understand the legislature for generations, first look at the landscape of Virginia in the early 19th century. The South was a society built on a paradox, preaching the rhetoric of liberty while maintaining a brutish labor economy rested on the backs of thousands of enslaved men, women, and children. Nat Turner was born in 1800, a child of the plantation system, but he was singular in his upbringing. To read and write by his masters, an anomaly that granted him a window into a world of religious fervor and historical narratives. He became a self-appointed, often preaching to fellow enslaved people, weaving together biblical prophecy and the harsh reality of their daily lives. By 1830, environment in Virginia was volatile. The invention of the cotton gin had shifted the economic landscape, while the rising tide of abolitionism in the North was causing a defensive, hardening, reactionary stance among Southern elites. Nat Turner was not a soldier by training, but he was a tactician of necessity. He understood that the institution of slavery relied entirely on built on the element of surprise and the psychological shock of an insurrection from within. He began by gathering a small, trusted group from within. They operated in total secrecy, meeting in trusted group of collaborators, meeting in the woods to plan their movements. They knew they could not win a conventional war against the might of the state militia, but they believed they could strike a blow so profound that it would force a realization of the fragility of the social order. On the night of August 21, 1831, the revolt began at the home of his master, armed only with axes, knives, and armed moved silently from house to house. The group moved silently was to neutralize their captors, gather arms, and recruit more individuals to their cause. As they moved toward the Southampton rebellion, the tactical progression of the rebellion was marked by a chilling sense of momentum. As they moved through Southampton County, then their number grew, eventually reaching around 60 to 70 individuals. They were disorganized, poorly armed, yet they were fueled by a desperate existential urgency. They managed to seize weaponry, horses, and supplies from the farms they raided, creating a state of absolute terror throughout the countryside. For those 2 days, these established order, the patrols, the laws, and the social hierarchy evaporated. The enslaved people were no longer subjects. They were agents of the own violent revolution. As news of the insurrection spread, the panicked white population fled toward the Semble, while the local militia came as they approached Jerusalem. The turning point came as they approached Jerusalem. The state authorities had finally organized a defense, realizing that this was not a localized dispute that threatened the survival of the plantation economy, that a full survival of the plantation economy. When Nat Turner, the training and fire, the disparity in training and firepower became immediately apparent. The insurrectionists were intercepted, and the cold, professional efficiency of the local cavalry. Nat Turner's forces were scattered, many were killed in the fighting, Nat Tomty in the kiln, and others were captured in the following days. Turner himself managed to evade capture for 6 weeks, living in the deep woods of Virginia, and taken into custody. The aftermath was a descent into an darker chapter of American history. The state responded with a wave of violence that far exceeded the scope of the rebellion itself. Dozens of enslaved people were executed without trial, their bodies displayed as a grim following in Nat Turner's system, which had been designed to uphold the status quo, pivoted toward total suppression. The Virginia General Assembly engaged in a heated landmark debate regarding the future of slavery, but ultimately they chose of enslaved people and curtailed the education of people, restricted of even free enslaved people, and curtailed the freedom of even free black citizens. The dream of gradual emancipation died in the halls of the state capitol, replaced by a rigid and commitment to the preservation of slavery at any cost. Nat Turner was eventually brought to trial in Jerusalem, he maintaining that he had been an instrument of divine justice, and he spoke with a haunting clarity about his motivations and his visions. He was executed by hanging on November 11, 1831. His body was desecrated, an attempt by the authorities to erase his significance. But the impact of his actions could not be undone. The rebellion had accomplished something that decades of pamphlets and petitions had failed to do. It had revealed the terrifying insecurity of the slave-holding class. It shattered the myth of the contented, docile laborer and forced the South to confront the realities, built on a foundation of the oppressed fury. When we consider the historical weight of the 1831 uprising, we have to look past the gore and the chaos to the underlying lessons of human agency. Turner was a man who acted when all the odds to survival. He was a product of a system that stripped him of his humanity, yet he found the internal resolve to attempt to tear that system down. The failure of his rebellion to achieve its ultimate goal does not diminish the fact that he forced a nation to stare into the abyss. The history of strategy is not always written by generals in grand halls. Sometimes it is written into their limits. If we reflect on the peace and the endurance of the human spirit, we of peace and the inherent to human spirit, we must bought through the subjugation of others is inherently fragile. True stability is not found in the suppression of voices, but in the recognition of a shared equal humanity. The tragedy of Southampton County is a reminder the resulting of Southamptons of justice fail, unseen, the resulting pressure often explode in ways that leave no one unscathed. History provides us with these difficult stories not to glorify violence, but to act a failure, and the lengths to which individuals will go to reclaim their dignity. As we look back at the events of 1831, we see the echoes of a changing tide. The rebellion served as a catalyst for the hardening of sectional civil war. The North viewed the aftermath with horror, immoral society, seeing brutal repression of the South as oidits, while the South grew increasingly isolated and defensive, clinging to their institution as if it were their identity. A dissension party, Turner became a figure of myth, feared by his enemies, and whispered about by those who saw in his actions and significant chapters in the American narrative. His story remained an American narrative, a testament to the fact that the quest for liberty is a constant, often struggle. The military failure of the rebellion was inevitable given the constraints of the time and the strategic force brought to bear against them. Yet, the strategic victory, if one can call it that, was the profound, permanent psychological shift in the American consciousness. The fear that took hold in Virginia in 1831 never truly dissipated, permeated the social, political, and eventual collision of cultures and ideologies, not just a possibility, but as a historical. When we study history, not just no thready, as jagged and poignant, we are looking for the thready that connect the past to our present reality, and there is perhaps no thread as jagged and poignant as this one. In analyzing the tactics used during the uprising, one might wonder if any other outcome possible. Could a different approach have yielded a better result for the participants? Historians often debate the what-ifs of this conflict. Would a more structured, coordinated insurgency have held off the state for longer? But the fundamental issue remained the overwhelming concentration of power in the hands of the state and the militia, each precisely why insurmountable. Yet that is precisely why we study the story. We are drawn to the stories of individuals who look at the impossible, not because they are guaranteed victory, but because they believe that the status quo is no longer a price, the 1818s they are willing to pay. As we conclude this examination of Turner's 1831 uprising, let us carry with us the understanding that historical narratives are rarely clean or simple. They are messy, violent, and deeply human. The story of define what we mean by freedom and what we are willing to risk for it. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that societies can be built on foundations that are deeply at odds with our most cherished values. By remembering these events, we honor the truth of our collective past. We continue to learn, not just to understand how not lost we have been, but to navigate the complexity we have been. We reached the end of this account of where we are going. But the conversation does not stop here. If you found this narrative compelling and want to continue exploring the turning points of history, the strategies of those that changed the world, and the stories you hit that subscribe against the odds, please make sure you hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support allows us to keep digging deeper into the archives of the past, to bring you the stories that others overlook. Let us know in the comments below what you think the 1831 rebellion. Would you have approached it differently, or was the outcome written in the stars? We want to hear your perspective on the debates that continue to shape the way we understand this pivotal moment in American history. Thank you for joining us on this explorations of the 19th century. Stay curious, stay engaged, and join us next time streaming our journey through the battles that define our human experience. Yet, to leave the narrative at the conclusion of the immediate violence to leave the most profound chapter of the violence of the story untold. The aftermath of the rebellion was not merely a reaction. It was a total transformation of the American legal and psychological landscape. In the weeks and months that followed, the panic that rippled through the South did more than solidify the cruel mechanisms of the slave system. It birthed a climate of pervasive suspicion that reshaped the very fabric of daily life for both the enslaved and the enslavers. We must look beyond the immediate bloodshed to see how the ghost of Nat government and the quiet parlors of the plantation paintings for decades to come. The legislative response was swift and draconian. Estates across the South began drafting what would come to be known as the slavecodes, that they aimed not just to control the labor of the enslaved, but to extinguish their very humanity enslaved. Literacy became a crime. The ability to gather, to preach, or even to move freely between properties was curtailed under the threat of severe corporal punishment. This is where the tragedy takes on a different hue. The rebellion, which sought to break the chains of oppression, inadvertently provided the state with the pretext it needed to tighten those chains further. It is a recurring pattern in history. The desperate trigger a backlash that appears to crush the scart in the Shorntush, yet it requires such brutality of the movement, regime that requires such brutality of the order to maintain Waijinpul. Consider the psychological toll on the white population. The realization that those they held in bondage could organ with such coordinated intensity shattered the myth of the contented servant, shattered been carefully localized. This wasn't just a localized, that just an insurrection. It was a failure of the entire ideological apparatus, a dustal slavery. The newspapers of the era, filled with exaggerated threats of further uprisings, created an environment where shadow and substance became indistinguishable. Every whispered conversation in the fields was suddenly viewed suddenly viewed as a conspiracy. This paranoia was the true legacy of the rebellion, a self-imposed and external one for the enslaved. It forced the South into a defensive crouch. Intellectually, a defensive civil war, not just possible, but insevitum, that made the eventual collision of the Civil War not just possible, but inevitable. We must also pivot our attention to the voices or ignored during that period. While the focus of our exploration has been the strategic complexity of the internal debates among the enslaved population itself, there were those who believed that direct violent confrontation was the only path to liberation, while others advocated for the long game of survival, cultural preservation, and long game sketches. These were not mutually exclusive strategies, but they often created friction within the community. When we debate the tactics employed in 1831, when does the duty to survive yield to the necessity of revolt? There is no easy answer, and the weight of that choice is something that the historical record can never fully capture, though. It is felt in every account of those who chose to stand their ground. As we widen our scope, we observe that not an isolated event, but a spark in a much larger tinderbox, precise to gain significant moral and political traction, because the mighty of the NTTT violence in Virginia forced the entire nation to confront the reality of the institution it had tolerated. But it made the abstract arguments against slavery concrete. It forced the question of whether the United States continued to exist half and half free. By examining this, we see that the rebellion was a pivot point that accelerated the timeline of national reckoning. It forced both sides to drop their pretenses. The era of compromise was slowly dying, replaced by an era of stark, irreparable division. Often that systems of oppression we see that systems of obedience when they are challenged, because the challenge forces them to reveal their reliance on raw force. The rebellion did not achieve its immediate tactical goal of ending slavery, but it achieved something perhaps more significant. It destroyed the illusion that the status quo could endure indefinitely. Every successful struggle for justice, whether it be in the 19th century or the radical challenge, reactionary systemic transformation, reactionary suppression, and ultimate change. The lesson for us today is that history is of disconnect accident, extreme pressure, but a cumulative aspects. The individuals involved in the 1831 rebellion were part of a long linear change their conditions. They chose to not speak their condition, and in doing so, they left a permanent mark on the conscience of the world. As we wrap up our final thoughts on this, consider the patient nature of our retrospective judgment. Consider the nature, critiquing tradition and morality from the ends actors never possessed. But if we are to truly learn, we must try to step into their shoes. But if we are to truly learn, we must try to step into their shoes. And we must weigh that against strip away the essence of the self. And we must weigh that against the monumental cost of an uprising. It is not our job to declare winners or losers in the moral sense that drive people to risk everything. The 1831 rebellion remains a testament to the fact that the desire for freedom is an inextinguishable flame. Eating when the embers soamed, waiting when the embers are stomped out, who the next gust of wind to reignite the fire. Perhaps the most essential takeaway is that the archive is not a place for dusty documents, a mirror. When we look into the history of Nat Turner, we are looking into the mirror of our own society and the values we claim to hold dear. Are we the beneficiaries of systems that require us to look away from the consequences of their foundation? Do we have the courage to acknowledge that history but what we are brave enough to uncover? The story does not end with the final entry in a ledger or the closing of a court case. It continues in the way we interpret power and the way we challenge injustice in our own time and that choose to honor those who came before us. And with that, we conclude our deep dive into this transformative moment. But a framework for thinking about the past in a way that informs your understanding, not just facts, in a way that informs your understanding of the present. Thank you for your unwavering attention, your curiosity, and your willingness to delve into the difficult parts of our shared human narrative. That the past is always with us, and the stories we choose to preserve. Until next day, the stakes on you to seek vigilant and continue to seek the truth, no matter how hidden it may be.